I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today, we have the pleasure of talking with Bryan Widenhouse. Bryan is a state legislative affairs manager with FAMM, which stands for Families Against Mandatory Minimums. He has spoken to members of Congress, testified to legislators, and helped to develop a speakers bureau to use his voice and the experiences of others to change the narrative of extreme sentences. He also serves on the National Life Without Parole Leadership Council for Human Rights Watch. Bryan served 31 years in a Louisiana prison for a crime he committed when he was only 17. Originally sentenced to life without parole, Bryan was released in 2020 after a law changed allowing juveniles to be considered for resentencing. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And I'm excited to have you. So let's jump in. I know you just got an amazing promotion with FAMM, and now you are running their state legislative affairs. Can you tell us, first of all, what is FAMM and what is your role as the state legislative affairs manager?
Well, thank you. Let me clarify. I am not running the the state legislative affairs. I'm one team member in our policy department. The way FAM operates, we currently work in 24 states and the federal system, and each policy person oversees a select number of states. And as my role, I oversee our policy initiatives in 6 different states right now. Currently, we're working in 24.
What kind of policy initiatives are you working on?
So FAM originally started, as you mentioned, against mandatory minimums. We're a little over 30 years old. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan sentencing reform organization. But beyond our initial start in pushing back against mandatory minimums, we've kind of evolved to work on issues like prison conditions, mostly through our prison oversight work, second look mechanisms, and probably one of the things that we really excel at is compassionate release.
And just to go back for 1 second, for the listeners that don't know what we're talking about when we say mandatory minimums, what we mean is there are some laws that say if you're convicted of X, Y, and Z, then you have to be sentenced to a minimum term of whatever the law provides for. And a lot of times those sentences are really extreme and don't take into context the person or the offense that was committed.
Well, not only do they not take into context the person, their genesis when they're created are often because there's some kind of high profile case in the news or a spike in a certain types of crime, and there's a lot of frustration and anger. And so these laws are created in a mindset where they're focusing on the worst of the worst cases. And so they impose this mandatory minimum that too often we find is much more than the majority of the regular people who aren't the worst of the worst cases. And so we tend to get to a point where so many people are over incarcerated, are given sentences longer than necessary, and people who may not necessarily the right solution may not have been incarceration for them, but because of these mandatory minimum sentences, judges' hands are tied. They no longer have the discretion to give an individualized, fair sentence to people based on their personal circumstances.
Right. And so, I know that you said you've been working on a couple of different areas. Can you tell us a little bit specifically about some states that are working on law changes that you think are really promising? Maybe something that's happening now in the news, or what are you working on?
Right. So I think every state is working on something to one degree or another. Uh, it's a kind of an ebb and flow. Sometimes things really go in your favor for a while. Sometimes they go against things that you're working on. And it could be crime trends or things that happen do affect policy work. I think some of the gains that we've seen over the past few years is in prison oversight. A number of states have created ombuds offices or prison oversight mechanisms. I think largely that's in part because you just think every general day when you get up and read headlines in the papers, how often have you heard about atrocious things happening behind prisons? A lot of civil rights violations or just some really bad stuff. And I think in response to that, legislators and lawmakers are now seeing that this is something that's very needed. I think the biggest one last year, we helped pass the Federal Prison Oversight Act in Congress. And I think a driving factor of that was the revelation that a female federal prison in California was so overrun and prevalent with sexual assaults by staff members that it was nicknamed the Rape Club. It's things like this that bring issues to the forefront and allow for a lot of reforms to take place. One of the other things that we're seeing some gains is what's called the emerging adult doctrine. And the reason I'm here today is because the Supreme Court in 2017 retroactively outlawed mandatory life sentences for juveniles. And they set the age at 18, but the science that supports the brain development and the component that was the main influencer in this decision says that young adolescent emerging brains aren't fully matured until the age of 25. And so the courts are kind of a little bit behind on the science when it comes to this policy, but we're starting to see courts, jurisdictions, and legislation, bodies of legislation up that age more. In some places, they'll up it to 19, 20, 21, some as high as 25.
Now, Bryan, you were just telling us about a little bit about the work FAMM's doing with prison conditions. And I mean, you yourself spent 31 years in a Louisiana prison. You spent some time in Angola, which is arguably one of the worst prisons in the entire country. You were just 17 when you committed a crime that a judge was required under Louisiana law to sentence you to life without parole. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience, about what that was like for you, and maybe share a little bit about what happened while you were in prison.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, well, I do remember correctly that I stood before the judge who presided over my trial and everything. So he has a lot of intimate knowledge about all aspects of the case. And when it came to sentencing, he mentioned that Louisiana law mandates life without parole sentences for this conviction. And he said, I don't think you deserve this, but I have no other option but to give you this one sentence. And yeah, so I was given a life without parole sentence. And I think what a lot of the country doesn't realize too, when we try juveniles as adults in adult court systems, and we do so for ages as young as 13 that I know of, it could be even lower in some places, that when they are convicted, they are sent to adult prisons, not to juvenile facilities. And as you mentioned, Angola was probably one of the worst prisons in the country. And when I was sent there, they were just on the tail end of a state of emergency because the prison had experienced a rash of suicides and violence and stabbings. And so it's not. And we talk about 31 years. We don't have time to get into all the things and experiences that I learned there. Uh, Interesting. You asked, what did I learn? I learned that people who have even the most serious crimes and the most extreme sentences, they can and do change. And I saw that time and time again. What's ironic is what we call the short termers. Um, they're a little bit slower on the change. And that's not because they're different people or they're not as good as the people with extreme or life sentences. They just didn't have the incentive to change. And so why put in the work? And I think the reason that people who traditionally serve these most extreme sentences or life sentences, when they are given a second chance, what we call second look, their recidivism rates are extremely low. They tend to do very, very well. And that's because they have the greatest incentive to rehabilitate and to change. Matter of fact, it's probably the only means that they can actually ever receive some kind of second chance is to demonstratively prove that they are rehabilitated, that they can do well in society, because there is no other mechanism for them.
Yeah, and it sounds like from what I know about your time there, you sort of you're 17, you get sent to this terrible, scary prison, really one of the scariest prisons. But it also sounds like you kind of took stock right away and you thought, you seem to have said, I made a terrible mistake. I'm going to take responsibility for that. And I'm going to do what I can with my time in prison to make a change, to make the world a little bit better, or at least my world. How do you think you came to that idea?
Well, I can't say, or I don't know how I came to that idea. I just knew that it hit me immediately. I could recognize that the harm I caused. I felt the guilt of it when I was sent to prison. That in Angola, that place that was just so, the hopelessness that you felt there was palpable. It was an experience that really gets you to your core, your base level. And I remember internally deciding with myself that, recognizing that I caused great harm and that I really, really needed to do something about it beyond being in prison. I wanted to make amends in every way I could. I knew that I could never restore or bring back the harm or people that I hurt, but I wanted to do what I could do, and that was helping others, helping others who are around me, fellow incarcerated people, helping the community in any way I could, and bettering myself as well. And I knew that it was the right thing to do. That's the all I can say is I knew it was the right thing to do. And I believe that even if I spent the rest of my life just doing good things, that it was worth it. And if I died in prison doing that, that's fine. It's not like I set out with this plan that um I didn't have a plan. I just was trying to do what was right.
One foot in front of the other, especially when you're facing an eternal sentence in prison, right? A death in prison sentence. And yet you remained not just oriented towards hope, right? You managed to accomplish so much in prison, right? I mean, you got what, three vocational
Yes,
degrees?
3.
And what were they in again?
So 2 are in carpentry, 1 was in horticulture, and ironically, very early on, I would try to get a vocational degree, and they would say, "No, you have a life sentence. You're gonna die here, so why should we waste resources on you?" But over time, they were having trouble filling slots, and so they opened it up to people who were serving extreme sentences. And so I jumped in with the gusto. And after I obtained 3, I was like, okay, I want to do welding next. They were like, no, that's enough for you. Sit down for a while.
Yeah, and again, listeners may not appreciate that, but when we send people to prison for life, the folks who are serving the most time are often denied access to programming because the idea is, well, they're never getting out. Why try to make their lives better? Why try to give them tools to improve? And we can talk about why that's a very short-sighted policy. But I want to just stay with you for a little bit more because you also, while you were in prison, got involved in a program called the JCs, right? And you became their president. And from what I understand, you ran quite a successful chapter. Can you tell us a little bit about
Right.
that?
So the JCs, which stand for the Junior Chamber of Commerce, was an organization that utilized community service as a vehicle for professional development, personal development. And I'm so thankful that the national organization has a prison chapter division. And I think there are a number of other organizations that actually have prison chapters. So kudos to those who reach in and provide programming for people who are on the inside. Some other examples that come to mind are like Toastmasters International or Carnegie Hall, and I'm sure there are numerous others. And it's not me personally. I came in to the organization that had already experienced some success. My predecessors, who are lifers like myself, when I came in, took me under their wing and mentored me and helped me to become a leader. I think prior to my taking over as president, we had been the number one chapter in the nation for 5 years. I ran it for 5 years and won number one chapter in the nation each year, but all the while grooming the next person in line, another young lifer who came behind me, and he took over and did very well for a while. So I think all in all, our run of being number one in the nation went for about 13 years. But the program also opened doors for us to create different types of programming because, like I said, it utilizes community service as a vehicle to train. So you're always trying to find different ways to create programs. We did a toy project for building handmade toys for needy children in the area. And it always goes beyond just like building toys. We actually put a lot of thought process into it. And so while it's great to have inmates who build these handmade toys to give to children who may not receive something during the holidays because they're living in poverty or things like that, but we also ask law enforcement organizations, local police and sheriffs to be the distributor of the toys because, traditionally their experience with law enforcement isn't always good. And we wanted them to have a positive experience with law enforcement. So a lot of thought goes into these different types of programming. And I think the toy project is one of the bigger hits that we came up with.
And that's amazing, right? To not only be able to help your community directly by distributing toys, but also by from prison, helping build ties between the community and local police officers. That's a really interesting vision that you might not expect to come out of people who are serving time in prison, particularly looking at law enforcement in that lens. And the other thing I know that you did, you're an artist, and I understand that you helped obtain a grant that created a prison art class. And through that art class, you went on to raise thousands, like thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars for New York City firefighters after the 9/11 terrorist attack. So tell us about that because that's amazing. That would be amazing outside of prison, and you did it from behind the walls.
Yeah, but let me back up a little bit first. I'm kind of reticent to say I did this or I did that because it's a very much a community effort. And I don't want to take credit for things that were a collective effort by a lot of different people. One of the other things that's important to note is things like this don't happen in prison unless you have the support of either the warden, the superintendent, or the staff. There are places where they're more welcoming and allowing for things like this. And we hear often, too often, that they're not allowed to do any type of programming. And if they suggest it, the answer is always no. But I was fortunate. The warden came to me one day and he handed me a grant application for the Louisiana Decentralized Arts Funding Program. And he knew I was an artist. He knew I was president of the JCs. He says, "Hey, see what you can do with this." And I was like, "Okay, when do you need it?" He says, "Monday." I said, "Today's Friday." So, I went around, I talked to the head of the education department and I got every advice I could. Most of it came down to come up with a catchy title and make sure your budget is spot on. The title I came up with was Artistic Freedom. And I thought I did great with the budget, but our club sponsor who sat in on the grant process when they were having the reviews, ours came up last and they were like, "This application here, we got a problem with it." And he was like, "Oh, no." He said, "You didn't ask for enough money." He said, they were like,
Oh.
"This is one of the best grants we have ever seen. It is well written." And they like tripled our funding. And it created an art class inside the prison that was both a therapeutic, but we were lucky to have this amazing art teacher who saw something in everybody. He just came in and he like in his heart immediately adopted all of us as his uh his sons or something. He really truly cared. But he wanted us to not only find therapy in art, but to use our art to help other people. We were always doing projects and programs to donate and raise funds. The biggest thing though is after 9/11 happened, he came in, he says, "We gotta do something." He says, "I don't know what we're gonna do, but we gotta do something." So we collectively worked on a firefighters memorial painting with the icon. We had a eagle's head in the background, the twin towers, and that iconic scene of the firefighters raising that American flag on the twisted metal piece of debris. And he says, we'll make prints off of this, we'll sell them, and we'll donate the proceeds to the New York Firefighter Disaster Fund. He says, maybe we'll make a few dollars, maybe we'll make some more, we don't know. We started with 1,000 prints and we sold out in like 2 days.
Is it possible to see that?
I would have to go and look. I don't know if the artist still has it up on his website, but I may have to I might be able to chase down an old image of it somewhere.
Well, to our listeners, if I can find that link, I will post it with the episode notes. Because that just gave me the goosebumps. As someone who lived through 9/11, I was living in Manhattan at the time. That's just such a powerful project that you did, and thank you for doing it.
But everybody focuses on, oh, you raised $35,000 for the New York Fire. Everybody focuses on that. I don't think people fully appreciate what it did for the incarcerated people. Not just this program, but all the programs. One of the biggest things that we did was a lot of fundraising for MDA, Muscular Dystrophy Association, and you can see the change in people when maybe for the first time in their life they help somebody. It's hard to describe. We used to have a saying on the inside, a man never stood so tall as to when he bent over to help a child. And just over the years, watching the change in people because they were given the opportunity to help others.
That's really powerful, right? And I think oftentimes so many people who wind up in prison because of violence that they perhaps committed were also the victims of such violence growing up. And when you're living in experiences of trauma, it's very hard to have the capacity to also help others. And so you're right, to be provided with that opportunity, it is transformative. It's amazing. I mean, really is. Now, just to stay with this art, so what kind of art do you do? Are you working on any art projects right now,
I
Bryan?
wish I was. It's always a draw. I want to get back to it. I want to do this, but working full time at FAMM, doing policy work and working with the National Life Without Parole Leadership Council, it just is time consuming. I see other people who did art on the inside have successful careers as artists. And I think early on, I felt like I was at that fork in the road. Do I want to be an artist or do I want to do this work that I'm very, very passionate about? Our president at FAM often says that, we get paid to help people. And so I really enjoy what I do. I think that my experience and knowledge of the system is beneficial. And so, it's a choice, one that I'm happy that in the choice that I made. But I do miss the art.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I can see that because that's an expression, but you're right. Your work every day is an expression of your passion. Um, and that brings us back to sort of what you're working on now. This is a podcast where we're looking at the idea of second chances. And I'm wondering if we could hone in just for a minute on some of the specific work that you're doing. And then maybe you could share sort of ultimately your thoughts about second chances. But you said that there are two areas in addition to prison conditions that you've been working on. One are second look laws, and one is compassionate release. And so, briefly, if you could tell us, could you give us some examples of what you think is a great second look law, so that folks who are listening may be inspired to reach out to their own legislators? And there's laws pending all around the country, right? New York's been thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. New Jersey's got something percolating, but it's just percolating. So tell us, Bryan, can you give us an example of a really good state with a really good second look law, or maybe a law that you're helping promote that if it got passed would be a good second look law?
If we can take a step back and look at what second look laws are to begin with, they're an opportunity to reevaluate sentences that were often imposed for decades on people. After a very lengthy time, we can reassess that original sentence to see if it's still appropriate, whether it still serves the interests of justice. I think the biggest example to use, or one that kind of got the ball rolling, was the juvenile lifers. Because the Supreme Court outlawed mandatory sentence for juvenile lifers, it put states into a position where they had to enact what's the so-called second look law to come into compliance with this ruling. And so many states came up with you can go up for parole or be resentenced in a court after 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, whatever, each state came up with a different mechanism. But interesting, since they kind of were forced to do that, roughly 30% were granted release because they actually were forced to take this second look. There are not a lot of examples of broad second look across the country. I think one of the better ones is in DC, the Incarceration Reduction Act, which has both play on second look, but also has that emerging adult component that we talked about. So they give a second look or an opportunity to apply for a second look after 15 years, and particularly for those who are under the age of 25.
What do you think should be that test? I mean, how many years should a person serve, do you think? Like, what if you could write your own second look law for all the states? At what point do you think a person should be? So, I'm sorry, just for the listeners, when we're talking about second look, so some folks are serving a life sentence that might carry with it parole. It might not carry with it parole, or they might be serving 150 years, which means they're never getting out either. And so these second look laws say, wait a second, we can actually set a period of time after which we can at least look at the person who's serving this term and decide whether, as Bryan was saying, it's still appropriate. Um, and so I'm wondering, Bryan, if you were going to write a law, how many years would you say people need to serve or should serve before they're entitled to this look?
And again, you're trying to pigeonhole me into one answer when we're trying to advocate for individualized. So every case is different. I know a lot of advocates start by saying it should be 10 years. Some say 15. And of course, then you have to balance that against certain types of crimes. You know, murder and is one of the more harder crimes, and some of those cases can be really difficult. I think 15 is a good baseline, but one of the other things that you have to remember about second look is that it's not a guaranteed release. So just because you look at a person at 15, and maybe you come back with the assessment that no, it's not enough time. No, this person's not ready yet. And I think you can revisit the situation in a couple years, 5 years. I think that's up to each individual state to come up with. But just because you set it at 15 is not a guarantee.
So, Bryan, what are some of the things that you're seeing? What are some of the biggest obstacles, the biggest challenges to getting second look laws passed?
Right. So while advocates like myself would like to see legislatures just pass these broad second look laws to apply to everybody, there's just not a lot of appetite amongst lawmakers for that. They're very reticent. A lot of still have cling to these tough on crime stances, or when you come to them with some kind of sentencing reform, they're just very reluctant to do that. And so we often have to approach it at different angles. One of the things I mentioned was compassionate release. That is a version of a second look law, but it's usually geared towards people who are dying or incarcerated in prison. One example this past year that we saw in Oklahoma was what's called the Domestic Survivors Justice Act, which gave second look laws to people, I almost said women, but it can apply both, who were victims of domestic violence, and that violence either played a role in their crimes. We see often sometimes people who are trafficked or abused to retaliate or, you know, fight back against their abusers, and sometimes they're charged and sent to prison for that. One example that just happened in California is we all know about the firefighters in California recently. What most people don't know is a significant portion of firefighters in California are incarcerated people. They work on these fires. I think there have actually been instances where people have died in the line of work, working on these fires. They're dangerous conditions. And so now they're at they're kind of in the spotlight right now because of, simply because of the fires that happen. They're paid pennies on the dollar. So we're seeing bills focusing on them to give them, better pay. But one bill is like, let's give a second look to these incarcerated firefighters in California, which I have mixed feelings on, because I advocate for second look. I'm like, yeah, let's give it to them. But why are we just focused on these California firefighters? What about the guy who's in prison who tutors people to teach them how to read? What about the guys who are in hospice programs who are caring for and bathing people who are sick and on their deathbeds? What about so many other people who are doing great programming? Why are we just focused on one demographic? Why can't we just give everybody a fair look?
Yeah, I mean, and you're right, like, people who are giving back, in meaningful ways and significant ways, that should somehow even up some of the scales a little bit.
But we see that we find easier pathways to give second look for these, specifics, firefighters, domestic survivors, emerging adults, juveniles. It's easier, people who are dying. But one of the first things that happens when second look laws are proposed is what's called carve outs. Too often we see, well, no, we don't want it to apply to lifers. We don't want it to apply to people who commit murder. We don't want it to apply to sex offenders.
Yeah, and those carve outs can kind of swallow the law whole. Yeah, and I know California's done some interesting things, right? I mean, I think they have a second look law also for veterans who can show that their crimes were somehow related to their military service. I think California is the only state that has passed some kind of law. So you're right that it seems to be a little easier to get specific categories of people second looks rather than these broader second looks.
Exactly.
You spent time in prison. You've been out now for a while. You've been traveling around the country and talking with all kinds of people about second look laws and second chances. What do you say to people who say things like, well, that crime was so terrible, so horrific, or, they took a life or they caused such harm that they should never be released because it's just not fair? What do you say to the people who push for that retributive argument that says, people should be held in prison in perpetuity solely to pay for the crime that they committed or the harm that they caused?
We see that a lot. And I think an analogy that one of my coworkers likes to use is that you've taken a snapshot in time of that person who committed this crime and the harm that he caused. But now it's 25, 30 years later, however many years later you want to put it at. We want to look at that person today. And we see so many instances when this person who's reticent or doesn't agree with us, who actually does take the initiative to look at that person today, and that's when they change. If you're focusing on the person 25 years ago, you're going to feel one way, but you have to actually look at the person later, because people say, well, I think, I believe if a person commits this crime, they should never be let out. Well, how many people have you talked to who've committed those crimes and have done 25 years of programming and life change trajectory experiences in prison?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's right. Like, I think we have created we have this system where we say when there's harm, the only way to remedy that harm is prison. And the worse the harm, the longer the prison sentence. And we kind of forget that there is this transformation that can occur. And that transformation not only can occur for the person who caused harm, but also for the person who was harmed. And that's not to minimize the loss or the pain that is suffered by people who are harmed, but it does mean that people can move through it in different ways, and that life sentences or really extreme sentences aren't always the only or even the best way to remedy harm.
I don't know if we can kind of rephrase the talk into more of perceptions. Um, so one of the examples that I would like to give is going back to some things that I did while I was incarcerated. I had this great progressive warden who was very open to ideas.
So, was this at Angola or is this at a different facility?
This is at a different facility. This is after I had moved on from Angola. But I really saw this need for victim offender reconciliation. Everybody talked about it. Everybody thought that it's a great thing, but nobody allowed it. There was no opportunity or mechanism to use. So I approached him. Well, actually, I approached the chaplain one day first. And I said, hey, I got this idea, this program I want to create, a victim offender mediation program, restorative justice, and all that. I could tell that he was like, "Oh yeah, that sounds great. Put in a proposal." But I could tell he was just placating me. He probably thought it didn't stand a chance at all. But I drafted the proposal up, sent it to Ward, and he said approved. And so I contacted somebody I knew through the Alternatives to Violence Project, who I knew had a compassion for this type of work and was studying for it. And she was like, "This is my dream. I can't believe you brought this to me." And together we put together this very intensive 16-week long course on both restorative justice and reconciliation. We brought in different types of impact panels from religious leaders, community leaders. Every person had to maintain a journal. We partnered with the victims assistance coordinators with the local district attorney's office to be the mediator in disseminating any letters of apology written to victims. We couldn't give it directly. We gave it to them and they would contact the victims and notify them that these letters were on file should they wish to receive them. But getting back to my point, one of the panels that we had was a victim impact panel. And there were two people who came in. One, her husband had been murdered, and she was also the victim of attempted murder, had a very big, large, pronounced scar on her neck where the person tried to slit her throat. And the other woman was actually a rape victim. And so here the group is sitting in the visiting room waiting on our guests to come in. And we're very, very anxious because we kind of anticipate maybe a lot of anger would be, put on. We didn't know what to expect. But I can remember the facilitator of the program and the two guests. As soon as they walked around the corner, you could hear a gasp from the older lady who had her throat cut. And she said something, she whispered something to her. We did not know later until after she left that what she said to her was, "Oh my God, they look just like real people." But a long story short, and I wish everybody could have experienced that day. So we all sat together. They told us their stories. We cried. We told them our stories. They cried. Um, at the end of 2-hour meeting, everybody's hugging and crying, and they're leaving like, "Oh my gosh, I wish the best for you guys." And it totally changed their lives. It totally changed our lives. But that happens because after time, people come and they see who we are today and not who we were. And that this is both ways, not who we were back on that day that that snapshot was taken.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And there's healing in that, right? I mean, there's justice in that.
And that's another thing that we see a lot when we try to advocate for the second look mechanism. People say, well, what about the victims? I can't tell you how many times I've been stunned to stand side by side with victims who are advocating for second look. We were lobbying in DC, and I remember this lady kept looking at me, and finally, when all the lobby meetings were over, we got a chance to finally talk. I said, "So, hey, nice to meet you. What brings you here to this event?" She was like, "Well, I had 3 family members who were murdered, but I don't think life sentences for young people is the appropriate response." And I was like, I was stunned by that and deeply humbled. I know so many victim advocates now who are saying, "I was hurt, but these extreme sentences are not healing me and they're not helping me." And maybe some of them, they started out on a path where I'm glad that person's in prison for life, but decades later they change. And one of the biggest examples, most heart touching, I know, is this person in Louisiana whose brother was murdered. And I don't want to, I know I have a tendency to tell these long stories, but
No, no, please.
he came to a point where he wanted to meet the guy who killed his brother, and they met, and now he advocated for his release, his commutation, and he actually says, "I lost a brother, but now I have a new brother," and these 2 are like they're like brothers now.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, and I've heard other stories that are similar to that. It's the capacity for forgiveness is extraordinary, and the capacity for change is also extraordinary, which I guess it brings us back to this notion of second chances. I mean, you were given a second chance. You advocate for others to receive second chances. What do you think people should know that maybe they don't know in framing this conversation? What would you like listeners to know that maybe they don't?
It's a hard thing to say because not every case is forgiveness and reconciliation. My personal case, my victims were staunchly opposed to my being released and getting a second chance. And so it's a difficult thing. I'm always cognizant of how they feel, and I try to be respectful. I understand. So there are instances like that too, where I don't know how to say it, but
I think that's right. I mean, that is right. I think that's true that there isn't, just as we are all not monoliths, right? People who have survived crime or been harmed by crime, it's not a monolith. Everyone has their own experience and their own reaction and their own needs. And yet that's a question, right? Which is how much power, what role do we give to the voices of people who've been harmed after certain years have passed? When I think just hearing you say that, that's got to be so painful because you have devoted ever since